caught my eye. A user wrote, if you do mention DID, please mention the plural self-advocacy movement for reforming the treatment of systems. Treating us all as mentally ill for being plural has caused so many of us harm. Not all systems dissociate. So out of this intrigue, I began doing a little bit of research about what they mean by plural, what plurality is, and what this is all about. Now, I don't know much, and I certainly haven't made myself an expert. I still am a bit confused about what is meant by the term system here, but I do think I have something of a handle that can be useful to describe here. Plurality or multiplicity refers, I still am a bit confused about what is meant by the term system here, but I do think I have something of a handle that can be useful to describe here. Plurality or multiplicity refers to the psychological phenomenon in which a body experiences multiple consciousnesses, or essentially multiple selves within it. These different consciousnesses are sometimes referred to as headmates or alters, a being or a body that contains multiple consciousnesses, and so essentially is multiple people, is sometimes called a pluran instead of a person. So as you can imagine, this type of experience and identity raises a lot of questions and conflicts about the way philosophically, spiritually, health-wise, security-wise, a lot of things. I'm not gonna come close to addressing all of that. And I definitely do not want to get involved and embroiled in discourse with alter-human communities, talking about communities that I'm not a part of, very little understanding of. I want to be able to mind my own business here and be respectful rather than start speaking out of turn. But for this particular video and this topic, what I think this user was getting at and how this situates itself in what we're talking about is how this phenomenon situates itself in our mental health system and our understanding of mental health in general, which is to say, wow, it's very complicated and wow, it's very tough. An article detailing the history of plural self-advocacy shows that plural people have attempted to speak for themselves for a very long time, often against the stigma of something being inherently wrong with them. The history of plural self advocacy shows that plural people have attempted to speak for themselves for a very long time, often against the stigma of something being inherently wrong with them mentally. For example, a book from 1993 written by multiple mental health professionals about what we now know as dissociative identity disorder, but at the time was called multiple personality disorder. I think you see where I'm going with this, posits that some perceive the alters as real people. It was only until recently when the medical community started slightly opening some doors here and there towards accepting the validity of plural people. And of course, this has been accompanied by the rise of social media, in which folks have been able to represent themselves across a ton of different communities and find community with others who share those identities. Of note was the rise of Plural Gang, which is a hashtag that emerged during HBomberguy's famous Donkey Kong 64 fundraising live stream, in which a Pluran came out on stream as being plural, and afterwards a bunch of people across social media started using that hashtag to also chime in and represent that community.
We are a plural trans speedrunner. We used to work for Games Done Quick and do a bunch of other speedrunning events and stuff. But we're here now.
I mentioned you.
Oh, what? You're the famous.
No,
what?
Everyone's famous.
Actually, I see some plural gang in the chat. Can we get some more plural gang in the chat, please?
Now, one of the biggest moments cited as a change in the mental health system's acceptance or acknowledgement towards plural people was in the DSM-5 and its changing of some wording, some verbiage about dissociative identity disorder to clearly state that the definition of the disorder has to necessitatively include distress and impairment. This is a big deal because what it's saying is not that the experience of having multiple selves is in and of itself a disorder, but rather whether or not it is distressful for you and impairing for you to feel like you are in and out of a self is a sign of the dissociation, is a sign of the potential dissociative disorder. And I think when you talk about that distinction, this is actually crucial to understanding how the mental health care system, as it shapes and evolves, can accommodate us and how we can use it across different ways of understanding how our brains work. I'll get into that after the break. Thanks for watching the ad breaks. It helps the channel a lot. So there's this thing we do where we relate to each other as humans. I know it's kind of weird. It's not going to happen anymore with the way that the internet is going, so don't worry about it. And sometimes we have to make a ton of assumptions without realizing that we've made those assumptions in order to try to relate to one another. The dissociation discourse illustrates that. A lot of people who share their struggle with dissociation, their extremely valid struggle with dissociation, will do so, very understandably, by talking about how they feel like they're outside of themselves in the way that I just did, which is to say, not necessarily by saying I'm going through a lot of pain outright, but by sharing an experience which we expect the other person will say, oh wow, that sounds horrible, because we have a certain trying to relate to one another thing. This is a subtle linguistic phenomenon that often isn't problematic at all. Like, one instance in which we do it is when we say, oh, I don't have anything to eat. We recognize that usually people will understand, because everybody generally eats, that you need something to eat. You're upset about not having something to eat. This is something that should change. This is a bad condition. And even if a person eats less than us, they'll sort of understand where we're coming from, of course. But if I tell you that I'm, for instance, struggling mentally, and I do so by saying, I don't feel like myself, we may not realize that there's a bit of a potential disconnect with some people. Not necessarily that we've done something wrong at all, but by the idea that some people may hear that and say, wow, that sounds horrible. But some people might hear that and say, oh, I do that all the time, actually. It's great. Because the distinction is the distress. Some people may experience things that are akin to dissociation, but if they don't have any distress, we can't really say that they're dissociating. They're probably just fine, and they just have a different brain. They have a different set of consciousnesses or consciousness.
You know, some systems, they see themselves as, we're here to serve an original person. Once we're no longer needed, we'll fade into the night, and that's fine. And that's integration. And for a long time, people in my field saw that as the goal.
That's always the goal, right?
That's always the goal, is to get them back to normal, whereas just one. But the more we study and the more we listen to the experiences of people who live with this, for a lot of them, integration isn't the goal. The goal is living in harmony. The goal is being aware of one another so we don't wake up with lost time and saying, what happened?
Yeah, that's probably not ideal.
Obviously, the wrong thing to pull from that would be to say dissociation is definitely good. The key distinction that DSM-5 makes, again, is that dissociative disorders come with distress and impairment. So, if you experience multiple selves, if you experience a being outside of the self, you're not dissociating at all. You may be a person whose brain does that and you're cool with it. It works for you, and that's great. And if you're fine, you're healthy, if you're getting on well, it's not okay for other people to come in and say, that's crazy, that's wrong. There's something wrong with you mentally because you just have a different thing going on. And I say this with some level of connection because to a degree, I relate to that. I used to get that feeling of dissociation a lot more, and I don't really anymore. Let me not jinx it, because I don't really feel distress anymore when I'm outside of myself. I actually just don't feel a strong connection to the idea of a self at all. That's like my thing. It's a thing we'd have to talk about in another video. But in short, I just kind of feel like the self is a construct and it's something that I think exists in a specific way and perform in a certain way and inhibit. But ultimately, I'm also constantly feeling like, you know what? There's a self that I'm outside of and I'm kind of controlling rather than feeling super attached to it as if it's a fundamental part of my existence. Again, super out there. This is a conversation about something else for another day. But the point is that the mental health system is constructed. It's a system through which we understand what's going on in our brains with the data and the accounts we have available. And then we come up with solutions to treat these conditions or experiences that is compatible with our social and economic systems. And that's a big part of why the mental health system often fails people. It is a human-made construct that has to work within other human-made constructs, all of which have huge flaws, particularly with exploitation and marginalization of people. And I'm saying all of this not to demean the positive abilities of the mental health system. Again, I highly recommend if you are having distress, if you are having concerns about your mental condition, that you should go out and seek medical professional treatment. Just know that if one thing doesn't work for you, there's always something else you can consider. You and your brain are never absolutely screwed. Every moment contains the potential for you to make a breakthrough, for you to find inner peace, for you to make sense of the things going on in your brain. And learning about how other people go through their own processes and figure out their own brains is a huge, huge help. So connect with one another. Thank you. That's the end of the video, I guess. If you like this video, hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe if you'd like to watch more. Hit the notification bell, because sometimes I go live, sometimes I do random stuff. And also, if you want to send me $1 to buy a bag of chips.
Would like to, gee, you know, people say this in television so many times, I'm ashamed to say it again, but I wish we had color TV tonight, because this is one of the most delicious looking album jackets I've ever seen. It's called Chuck Berry is on Top. And that is the wildest. There are some great sides in here. Almost Grown Carol, Maybelline, Anthony Boyd, Johnny B. Good, JoJo Gunn. It's well, anyway, so be it. Here is the current one that's setting the country on its ear. Back in the USA, Chuck Berry.
Oh well, I feel so good today. We just touched down on an international runway. Jet propelled back home from overseas to the USA. New York, Los Angeles, oh how I yearn for you. Detroit, Chicago, Chattanooga, Baton Rouge. Let alone just to be at my home back in old St. Louis. Did I miss the skyscrapers? Did I miss the long freeway? From the coast of California to the shores of the Delaware Bay. You can bet your life I did till I got back in the USA.
Someday you got to show me how to do that. That is the wildest.
Hello everybody, you're welcome back again to the Reggae Appreciation Society. The story of reggae music is well known and frequently discussed, but what is often overlooked is the story of a small but powerful group of influences from the Chinese Jamaican community. The likes of Tom Wong, Byron Lee, Vincent and Patricia Chin, and Leslie Kong are an unsung backbone of studio engineers, musicians, producers, record store, as well as record label owners that played a massive but uncelebrated role in the development of reggae and Jamaican music as we know it today. The origins of the Chinese Jamaican community dates back to the middle of the 19th century. After the abolition of slavery, a sizable number of Hakka Chinese emigrated to the island to work as indentured laborers. A century later, more than half of their population were Jamaican born and had cemented their role in society. Most of them owned businesses like grocery stores, betting parlors, ice cream shops, and laundry services. But over time, many went on to collapse their businesses and invested in the music industry. It's only a handful of them that we're going to take a look at in this video, but let's go. Tom Wong. Tom Wong was the founder of the island's first commercially successful sound system, which he established in 1950. He basically created the template that others would adopt and replicate. To get a proper grip on how big a deal this was, we need to take a look at the history of the sound system culture. Back in those days in Jamaica, not too many people in the inner cities and ghettos could afford record players in their homes. Those who could would often set up their gear outside so their neighbors could come around, listen, and have a dance and a nice time. Eventually, some business-savvy people found that they could sell drinks or food and invest the returns in better sound system equipment, and this created what became an integral part of inner city culture. Indigenous genres of Jamaican music like ska and rocksteady were being ignored by the radio stations and could only be heard at these sound system events. Thus, by the 1950s, sound systems were even more popular than live bands and radio. Tom Wong started the sound system by first investing in powerful amplifiers and assembling a professional crew of a selector, sound engineer, and an MC. To keep the crowd energized, the MC, or DJ in Jamaican parlance, would have to toast. Toasting is essentially the art of speaking over instrumentals in a rhythm. Eventually, the crowds began to like the toasting even more than the songs themselves. Tom Wong hired a DJ called Winston Cooper, aka Count Machuki, and he was one of the pioneers of toasting. His excellent wordplay and lyricism took toasting to a whole new level, winning lots of fans and disciples in the process. And one of his disciples was a young man called Stuart Beckford, who would come to be known as U-Roy. U-Roy was the first person to release a single entirely based on toasting in 1970 and created a subgenre of reggae music. Tom Wong cemented the sound system culture and inadvertently spawned dancehall. Byron Lee. This visionary genius musician and producer invented rocksteady, which evolved into reggae. In 1967, a Shanghai-born singer named Stephen Cheng came to Jamaica to record a song, which was a Taiwanese folk tune called Always Together. He teamed up with Byron Lee for the instrumentals, and the beats that Byron produced were an adaptation of ska and would become known as rocksteady. Byron Lee also gets the credit for introducing the electric bass guitar to Jamaica. The musicians on the island only used to play the double bass, which Lee found bulky and difficult to move around from gig to gig. He would thus spark a musical revolution in Jamaica when he imported and started using the electric bass guitar, which was louder and clearer than the double bass and boasted of an in-your-face quality that was irresistible to listeners. And it was this bass guitar which was instrumental in launching the careers of reggae pioneers like Jimmy Cliff, Toots and the Maytals, and the Blues Busters. His band, Byron Lee and the Dragonaires, was one of the leading bands in Jamaica, and they even made an appearance in the 1962 James Bond movie Dr. No, which was partly filmed in Jamaica. The band is also credited with unveiling and introducing future reggae legends like Dennis Brown, who began to perform with the band at the age of 9, and Marcia Griffiths, who started out as a backup singer with Byron Lee and the Dragonaires at the age of 15. Lee established Dynamic Studios in 1969 and it became the foremost recording facility in the entire Caribbean. It was the studio where an uncountable number of hits were created for the likes of Toots and the Maytals, Eric Donaldson, Jimmy Cliff, and Bob Marley. Incidentally, it was the studio where Bob Marley went to record his first single titled One Cup of Coffee that was produced by the icon that is next on our list, Leslie Kong. Leslie Kong is celebrated for being the first Jamaican record producer to craft international hit songs. He produced groundbreaking tunes for Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Jimmy Cliff, Toots and the Maytals, and Desmond Dekker. In fact, reggae got its name from a song that Kong produced for Toots and the Maytals titled Do the Reggae in 1968. Kong entered into the music business in 1961. Up until then, he had been fully engaged in the family business, which was a restaurant that he ran with his brother called Beverly's. All that changed when late that year he received a visit from a teenage boy who had traveled from his village all the way to Kingston in search of greener pastures. The boy wanted to write a song for the restaurant in exchange for some cash. Seeing the potential, that led Kong to launch his own record label, which he also named Beverly's, and led him to record the teenage boy's first single. That boy's name was James Chambers, but became known more popularly as Jimmy Cliff. Kong was also one of the original founders of Island Records before selling his share of the company to Chris Blackwell. The Hookim Brothers. After the Jamaican government banned gambling on the island, four brothers divested from the family business, which was an ice cream parlor, liquor store, and a gambling house, which was situated just off Spanish Town Road, not too far from Trench Town. The eldest brother, Joseph, better known as Jojo, had always been intrigued by music, and after a childhood friend of his, in popular singer John Holt, had asked him to accompany him to Byron Lee's Dynamic Sound Studios for a recording session, he decided to invest in the music business. By 1972, the Hookim Brothers had set up the now legendary Channel One Studios and record label at 29 Maxfield Avenue in Kingston. They started with a basic 4-track recorder, and by 1973, the hits had started rolling in, with lots of ace producers like Lee Scratch Perry using the studio to record their music. By 1975, the studio had invested in an advanced 16-track recorder. This allowed sound engineers to produce more intricate music with a robust sound that the island had never heard before. Channel One Studios became an unstoppable force, cranking out a slew of hits from the mid-1970s, totally eclipsing established studios in Jamaica like Coxsone Dodd Studio One, Duke Reid's Treasure Isle, and even Dynamic Studios that inspired them in the first place. Future legendary rhythm section Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare first came together and honed their craft as part of the studio's in-house backing band, aptly called the Revolutionaries. The studio also solidified the credibility of dancehall as legendary dancehall producer Henry John Joe Laws recorded the first tracks and albums of eventual reggae legends like Yellow Man and Barrington Levy. Let's not forget the studio and label's biggest stars, the Mighty Diamonds, whose debut album, Right Time, became just one of the greatest reggae albums of all time. Vincent and Patricia Chin. In the late 1950s, a couple opened a record store called Randy's Record Mart. Vincent Chin had previously worked for a multi-millionaire hotel owner named Isaac Issa, stacking records into jukeboxes. He began to collect the old discarded records and eventually began to sell them out of his own store. This store would become the stepping stone to establishing the world's biggest reggae record label. By the early 1960s, many Jamaicans had moved abroad to form a populous and thriving Jamaican diaspora in the UK, the US, and Canada. These folks abroad were homesick and longed for music from Jamaica. This stimulated a thriving record export market. The Chins sensed an opportunity beyond just selling records, and after moving their store to a new site, they converted part of it to a recording studio. And by 1968, their studio, named Studio 17, became just one of Jamaica's top recording outfits and recorded thousands of artists that included the Wailers, the Heptones, Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs, Burning Spear, and virtually all the top acts from the late 1960s down to the mid-1970s. The Chins moved to New York in 1977 and established a store on Jamaican Avenue in Queens. They made their move to harness the power of a fast-growing Jamaican community that was one of the most populous and vibrant Jamaican clusters outside of the island itself. They established VP Records, which would go on to act as an international distributor of reggae music. And this, more than any other single factor, became a launch pad for reggae music to go international, starting from the US. Today, as far as reggae is concerned, 9 out of 10 international superstars are VP Records affiliated. The Chinese Jamaican community has played and continues to play an amazing role in the establishment and movement of reggae music, from a Jamaican-born art form to one of the greatest genres of music in the world today. So there you have it. Thank you for watching the video today. Please leave a like, subscribe.
In general, I've found it to be surprisingly difficult to thoroughly explore music from countries outside of the main English-speaking market that I'm accustomed to. Occasionally I've stumbled upon a singular artist from elsewhere that grabs my attention, but that alone never fully opened the door to their country's music in general. Pretty quickly, a dead end comes after that. In contrast, I'd grown very used to just how easy it was to keep moving through English music when I was initially exploring different decades of it. The evolution, mythology, and influences of rock and pop music from the 50s to probably about the early 2000s is clear-cut. The pillar albums of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, who each artist was influenced by, who their work ended up influencing in turn. The whole music family tree for that era is so well established that you can practically jump in, start at any point, and have no shortages of branches to follow to discover new stuff from there. Like if you're a teenager who just found out who Nirvana is and want to find similar bands to listen to, then it doesn't take a lot of searching to find out that their contemporaries at the time are Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, or that their drummer went on to form Foo Fighters, or that Nirvana directly influenced mid-90s rock bands like Weezer or the post-grunge scene, or that Nirvana themselves were influenced by bands like Pixies, Dinosaur Jr., the underground 80s scene in general. It's so easy to expand outward from a single point. But coming from that American perspective into other countries' music, it felt a lot choppier. And for a while this was even the case with Japan, which was probably the country outside of my main musical orbit that I would get exposed to the most, largely through anime openings that are more often than not great songs. Finding branches to follow from any of those songs, however, was touch and go. If you keep digging, of course you will eventually find stuff to sink your teeth into, but that took a lot longer than I'd prefer. Even now in the internet age, yeah, you have some essentials charts from 4chan or some videos that talk about a single artist in isolation, but the sources on where to start and where to move on to from there, especially one that informs you more than this, that just lists 40 albums and leaves it at that, felt pretty scarce. Surprisingly though, that lack of a well-established musical canon is even somewhat the case from a Japanese perspective. From reading the book Quit Your Band by Ian F. Martin, he explains that music in Japan was viewed differently from other art like literature. There wasn't as much of a culture of criticism there. Having outright negative reviews was seen as taboo, and when that type of music discussion gets homogenized, it lessens the ability to highlight and lift up works positively. It wasn't until 2007 that a magazine, Rolling Stone Japan, broke an unspoken rule and actually ranked what they consider the top 100 Japanese albums of all time, causing a few others to eventually follow and only then start to carve out the main pillars of the country's music. So that's part of why its musical trajectory isn't as clear-cut as the English rock canon, and beyond that, there's also the fact that Japanese artists were often partially influenced by Western ones, so it isn't as self-contained. From an American perspective, we don't feel much of them crossing over with us. And the thing about that is, yeah, they don't need to cross over. Behind the US, Japan has the largest music industry in the world, and their market is notably different from most others in that a large sum of their profit still comes from physical media. Like, look at CDs. They're everywhere in Japan. They even still release singles on CDs. Like, when's the last time that was common in the US? A few factors beyond that are how bands could often be lumped into the expectation that a band being from Japan just means they're kooky, high energy, and weird by Western standards. Sometimes a band that does manage some crossover did so because they don't necessarily fit into a Japanese scene, and in that way don't end up connecting fans to other artists. A lot of notable Japanese artists were only added to streaming services in recent years. It's not like a ton of acts tour the US or that they're marketed here either, which again, as unfortunate as it is pretty understandable since it would just be a waste, probably. Especially with touring, it's tough for them to do all that traveling and manage to break even in the US, because while Western music often influences musicians in Japan, that feeling generally isn't reciprocated. I mean, it was only a few years ago that the Oscars realized a foreign film can deserve awards outside of its own category, and it's not too different with foreign language music as a whole. Until the sudden surge in popularity of K-pop around 2018 or so, there were only 16 songs that were predominantly in a different language to even reach the Billboard Top 10 in the US, only one of which was Japanese back in 1963. It's not an easy market to break into from the outside. So, where to start and where to go wasn't exactly served on a silver platter. Having an anime opening that I really loved did not exactly open the doors to explore several genres with confidence. It took a while, and I wish that initial process was a lot faster because there is absolutely no shortage of great artists here. So what we're going to do is chronologically go through 11 albums that touch on a different genre and era, talk about that album.
Twins, the Tolmachevi sisters, who themselves hadn't said anything homophobic but became a target for the audience's anger towards Russia. They booed the girls while cheering Conchita.
Thank you very much, screen.
Despite this, the Russian twins actually found themselves leading the scoreboard. At least, to begin with. Conchita gradually made her way up the scoreboard, gaining points from all over Europe, including Russia itself, until finally it became clear, before the last points had even been given, that no one could overtake her.
It's no longer possible for any other country to catch up. We are ready to announce the winner. The winner is Austria!
Conchita Wurst had won the Eurovision Song Contest, the first drag queen and the first openly gay man to win the show.
This night is dedicated to everyone who believes in a future of peace and freedom. You know who you are. We are unity, and we are unstoppable.
Conchita performed her song again, but this time the lyrics took on a whole new meaning. She changed the words at the last minute to say, rather than I will rise up, that we will rise up. And we all knew this wasn't just a victory for Austria, this wasn't just a victory for Conchita, but for queer people everywhere, for gender non-conforming people. It was a victory for liberation and freedom, a slap in the face for Russia and their homophobic law. And they say Eurovision's not political. The Eurovision Song Contest is commonly considered to be very, very gay. At least it has been for the last few decades. We've had a gay winner, a trans winner, bi winners, lesbian winners. But Eurovision actually has a secret gay history, which goes back to the very beginning. Even when it was impossible for contestants to be out in the 50s and 60s, it was well understood that there were gay performances happening. The gay fans knew who was gay and which gay people were producing songs. The winning song in 1961 was about a gay relationship and the struggle of being together in a homophobic world. Except the lyrics were all made gender neutral to disguise the true meaning. But gay fans knew. They knew. Eurovision is also famous for its campness, and the gays do love a bit of camp. But the challenge of bringing open queerness to Eurovision took a surprisingly long time. The first out gay contestant wasn't until 1997, and yet his act is surprisingly heterosexual for one that simultaneously looks so gay. Trans singer Dana International won for Israel in 1998. In 2000, the Israeli band Ping Pong brought both Israeli and Syrian flags on stage as a message of peace, which enraged the Israeli broadcasters so much that they disowned them and said that Ping Pong would have to cover all of the Eurovision expenses on their own. All the drama around flags kind of overshadowed the fact that Ping Pong also gave us the first Eurovision gay kiss. It was just a little peck, but it's there. And that would be both the first and the last gay kiss at Eurovision for a long time. A fun Slovenian drag act brightened up 2002, but 2003 was when the real controversy began. Young people won't remember that Russia was once notorious for its supposedly lesbian teen pop duo Tattoo, who took the world by storm by pretending to be girlfriends. I know it's hard to imagine now, but this was a time when Russia's biggest cultural export was probably this supposed pair of teenage lesbians. Russia was hoping that the global popularity of these girls would finally bring them their first Eurovision victory, meaning that Eurovision would then be hosted in Russia the following year. The girls were notorious for being provocative and sexy, and had suggested their Eurovision act would include some of said sexiness. But the Eurovision showrunners said that a backup recording of their dress rehearsal would be made just in case the girls kissed, so it could be censored. This was a family show, they said, and a lesbian kiss would be inappropriate and would lead to a disqualification. Oh yes, such a family show Eurovision is. Nothing sexy or naughty here. Nope, nothing to see here, folks. We all just pray to Jesus during the ad breaks. Effectively, gay kissing had been banned at Eurovision. In the end, Russia didn't win, and Tattoo didn't even attempt to kiss. Nor did they attempt to kiss when Russia finally did host in 2009, and Tattoo reprised their performance with a military choir and flowery tanks. Wow, thank you, Russia. That was so totally normal of you. Good job. But this was 2009, and by now, queerness at Eurovision was becoming increasingly more visible and accepted. Serbian lesbian Maria Sherifovic won in 2007 with Molitva. She wasn't out at the time, but it's pretty clear what's happening here, with Verka Serduchka's drag act coming in second place above a slew of other queer and camp performances, though certainly no gay kisses. When Serbia hosted in 2008, they really leaned into the lesbian aesthetic of Molitva with a full-on lesbian wedding. They were like, yes, lesbians, work that gender. So when Eurovision Eurovision went to Russia in 2009, local LGBT activists wanted to leverage the international attention of Eurovision to organize a pride parade in Moscow on the day of the Eurovision final, despite the fact that the mayor had actually banned pride as he had in the previous years. The parade was broken up by the police and at least 40 protesters were arrested. Sadly, Tattoo's flower tanks didn't do much to advance gay rights that year in Russia. That year's winner, Alexander Rybak, said after the show,
"It's a little bit sad that they chose to have this parade today, because the biggest gay parade in the world was tonight, you know?"
2013 saw a particularly misogynist song about being a submissive wife to your husband suddenly reveal a surprise gay ending. Oh, I see. She's a submissive wife to her wife. Wow. What a twist. The performer, Krista Siegfried, stated that the kiss was meant as a message urging her country, Finland, to legalize same-sex marriage. Now, Eurovision is technically supposed to be apolitical. They're very clear about that.
Please remember that our motto is building bridges, and music should stand over politics tonight.
Yet, somehow, these gay marriage messages just keep getting through. So at this point, there seems to have been a precedent set by performances like Siegfried's and Ping Pong's that gay kisses at Eurovision don't usually come from queer performers, but are rather used for political and showbiz purposes. They tend to have this vibe of like, oh look, it's so heterosexual and wholesome, boom, it's gay, gotcha. In fact, as far as we can find, gay kisses in Eurovision have only been performed by straight people, or at least not anyone who's out. This means that the only queer performer who considered a gay kiss on stage, Tattoo member Yulia Volkova, who actually turned out to be bisexual for real, was told no by Eurovision producers. Obviously, Tattoo's kiss wasn't going to be genuine or wholesome and really would have been as much of the shock value as Ping Pong's, but how wild is it that Eurovision banned a gay kiss from Russia that was completely apolitical? But then again, I suppose we saw things very differently back in the 2000s, such as Terry Wogan with his UK commentary when he saw Serbia's very lesbian performance could only bring himself to constantly remark on how unattractive he found Maria Sherifovic.
Now this Maria is a homely looking girl. You see, looks aren't everything. It's that little strange looking girl.
The UK's act that year was a pandering camp song full of innuendo and European flags, because surely that's enough to get every country to vote for you. Just wave their little flags and they say, oh, that's me, I'll vote for you, UK, I'll vote for you.
Pull firmly on the red cord and blow into the mouthpiece.
I understand pull on the red cord and blow into the mouthpiece is meant to be suggestive, but it is one of the more upsetting innuendos I think I've ever heard. Wogan was convinced, as people voted for Sherifovic and ignored the UK's beautiful pantomime, that it must be an Eastern Bloc conspiracy. The communists taking over Eurovision.
We're going to have to build a wall.
It seemed like Eastern Europe was too uncultured to see the heart and soul that went into the UK's song. I think that what the UK doesn't understand is whenever Brits threaten to come to another country, people assume they're either going to try and invade and colonise, or, more likely, get drunk and make a mess, neither of which is particularly fun for anyone else. Western Europe felt that the Eastern countries must be discriminating against them because the former commies didn't understand normal things like democracy and meritocracy and objectivity. They're corrupt and conniving, you see, as you would expect a communist to be. This had to be true rather than the idea that they were just sending good stuff. Where Western European artists would avoid something as tacky as Eurovision, Eastern artists were excited to go, sending the biggest, most popular stars in their regions, while Western Europe was sending camp flight attendants and turkey puppets. And it seems like the reason Western artists saw Eurovision as tacky and bad for their careers was at least in part because Terry Wogan made Eurovision into a joke. In Eastern Europe, it's taken more seriously, so they just send better content. But Wogan wasn't totally wrong about bloc voting. It is a thing. Countries commonly vote for their neighbours, but it's not really for political reasons, and certainly not for the sake of communism, but just because they share languages and culture and music markets. Singers popular in Serbia will also be popular in Croatia, while singers popular in the UK will also be popular in Ireland. In fact, Wogan didn't seem to have a problem with the fact that the only countries giving the UK any points were the ones that the UK had previously colonised.
So you see, you can always rely on the Irish.
If bloc voting were a real problem, the same countries would be winning every year. Eastern European countries just weren't winning disproportionately. They didn't even win half the time, yet the West was convinced that a great injustice was happening to them. That same year, in 2007, Austria complained that the contest had become politicised, and they felt so victimised by Eastern Europe's success that they quit and didn't come back for another 3 years, ignoring their own history of political choices. Austria's song that very year was an activist anthem created for an HIV fundraiser, but I guess in their eyes that didn't count as politicising the contest, and yet Maria Sherifovic's love song did, because I guess she is Serbian.